Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, I wanted to share the second half of my conversation with Dr. Barbara Oakley, who is a distinguished professor, engineer, and globally recognized expert in the fields of learning and neuroscience. In this second part of my conversation with Barbara, we're going to explore the science behind learning, the difference between declarative and procedural learning systems, and why strategies like active recall and interleaving can supercharge your learning abilities. Plus, Barbara's going to share her thoughts on how leaders can make their learning stick, not just for themselves, but also for their teams. Let's begin. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Now, with active recall, that really speaks to how to improve your declarative learning system. And the declarative learning system is that learning system we've been talking about so far for this interview about facts, assimilating information from new material, new context. But there's also another type of learning system called the procedural learning system, which at first many people thought it just dealt with motor skills. But I love your distinction in the book because you state that this is really a complementary learning system for a lot of different learning, not just motor skills.
That's right. For example, when you are gaining an intuitive, let's say you memorize the multiplication tables. So you really know them. What you've done through this is you have trained your basal ganglia procedural system, that same system that you learn habits from. You've trained it to have an intuitive feel for the relationships between numbers. So, unfortunately, in the 1970s, when calculators first came out, a lot of well meaning but misguided educators and psychologists began saying, well, you don't need to memorize things because you can always just look it up. Well, that's like saying, I don't need to memorize vocabulary in a foreign language because I can use Google Translate. I can always look it up, but I don't know how to speak that foreign language. And in a similar way, I don't know that language of mathematics intuitively. When you learn how to solve a Rubik's Cube, you're using that procedural basal ganglia system. And when you're, and of course, when you're thinking intuitively about mathematics, a lot of intuitive or that intuition that you develop is really through that basal ganglia system, which we erroneously equate only to motor skills sorts of things.
There's two effective learning strategies that's going to help you in this system. And that's one is called interleaving. And that's really kind of recognizing patterns. And that's in contrast to block learning.
Interleaving is a really cool technique. And language teachers automatically use interleaving. So they don't really think about it sometimes because let's say I'm learning how to speak Spanish and I say the Spanish equivalent of, I went to the store yesterday and tomorrow I'm going to go to the store again. I've naturally used past tense and present progressive tense so I can mix up words and different verb tenses and so forth. I'm mixing things up. And when you're learning a foreign language, you often, just to speak it, you naturally have to, mix things up. It's not just a vocabulary list that's in the same order all the time. But let's say that you're learning how to calculate the circumference of a circle or the area of a circle or the volume of a sphere. Let's say there's these three different things. We often, for example, we would do a whole bunch of volume calculations and we'd have maybe a different R value. The radius would be different. And so we do a bunch of calculations and then we go, great, we know how to calculate a sphere, the volume of a sphere. And then we go and we practice a lot with calculating the area of a circle. and then the circumference of a circle, right? So we can do each of these, individually. If somebody says, this problem involves the circumference of a circle, you can put it right down what the appropriate equation is, and then you can solve it. But let's say that somebody gives you 3 problems and you don't know which one's which. You don't know which one's the area, which one's the circumference, which one's the volume. And you have a whole bunch of problems like that, and they're all mixed up. That's kind of what happens on a final examination. But you actually haven't studied that way. You've always studied just, okay, you already know it's going to be the volume of a sphere, and so you know how to do all those calculations. So interleaving means having different techniques and mixing them up so you get practice picking out which equation is the right equation to be using. And that's kind of what we do automatically, of course, when we're learning to speak another language, because we have to pick out what are the right words in various contexts. But we don't do that so much when we're learning in math and science. And this interleaving, this mixing up, instead of just giving 10 problems in calculating circumference, we mix up circumference with perimeter and calculate, kind of mixed up things. That is really helpful in allowing us to gain an even better sort of procedural system, habitual understanding, intuitive of how to work different kinds of problems.
When I love how interleaving means varying or mixing those different concepts. Like you say, it's the opposite of block practice, where you focus on plenty of practice with a single concept before dropping it and moving on to that next concept. I find that this style of learning seems more chaotic, but it gives you more chances to contrast the differences between the styles, which helps you more rapidly develop pattern recognition skills, which is what your procedural learning system is all about. So you got to work through those initial feelings of frustration, and you're going to find that you're learning the material much faster by doing this interleaving instead of block practice. The other thing that I see with students as well as with adult learners is cramming. So to contrast cramming, which is not a good skill to have, where you just do all the studying or the learning in one session, space out your learning, because that allows for many more opportunities to consolidate that information and to get that information into long-term memory, correct?
Right. You don't want to spend 5 hours on a weekend learning a concept. You want to be revisiting like an hour a day, most days during a week, if you can, because each time you visit it, but then you sleep on it, it's not only you're learning during that time you're studying, you actually also learn during sleep. Your brain is revisiting hundreds of times, actually, and kind of repeating and sending signals that are reinforcing what you learned that day. So 5 hours spaced out is going to help your learning much more than 5 hours all in one clump.
What is the ideal time to space it out? Is there a certain formula or strategy? I know with the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, they have certain structures that's somewhat outdated now because that was nonsensical memorization that Ebbinghaus was trying to get them to do. Bjork and Bjork had a lot of great studies on that to try to identify what was that spacing effect. But from your expertise, what would you say is kind of a good model to go by in terms of reinforcing the information you just learned?
I'm probably a lot more slapdash than most people are. I've never really figured out the optimal. I mean, they will tell you the optimal spacing is right before you forget. Well, how do I know when I'm going to forget something? I really struggle with that. So it depends on how important it is to me. If I struggle to learn it one day and I've repeated it a couple times, that's a good signal that I better get right on it again the next day. I just use a bit of common sense, I think, and it seems to work pretty well.
Well, and you mentioned too that cramming forms initial connections, but it doesn't allow them to be moved into long term memory where they can be strengthened and consolidated. So when you cram for a test, when students have, and I have plenty of times in the past, it goes away fairly quickly because nothing is gotten into the long-term memory. Those initial connections haven't been allowed to be consolidated over time through periods of diffuse thinking, rest, sleep. Sleep is so critical for learning as well. And a lot of readers, or a lot of leaders rather, they read books and they brag about how many books they read. But when it comes down to it, Barbara, I find that a lot of them can't tell me what they've applied or what is even in those books. So, any good strategies that we've mentioned so far, or in addition to those, that would help leaders when they're reading books that they want to better themselves, self help books or business books that they can use?
The best technique I've found is I write a short summary of each book and I post it online so that it kind of keeps me rigorously honest. Okay, I finished this one, and then you kind of have it's going out into the public, so you kind of have to do a good job. Is it perfect? Do I remember everything about all books? Absolutely not. But at least it helps me to know what my favorite books were, what the key topics in those books were. And sometimes that can help me in the most surprising times. It's like, oh, yeah, I read this book 35 years ago. Uh, and it actually has a relevant topic, that really helps fill in my information about this particular strategy or whatever. Also, of course, I just love reading books because it's surprising how it can allow you to have something in common with so many different people. If you read widely, it's amazing that you'll kind of ping onto something that whoever you meet, you might know a little bit about something that they like or are interested in.
You mentioned too, and I think this is really apropos, is avoid passive reading practices, right? Like we talked about, highlighting and rereading. Instead, practice recall reading. After you read a page carefully, try to pick out key ideas and look away and either tell yourself or write down those key points. And this can work with notes as well, because many people in trainings and learning, they take notes, but it's important with those notes to do certain things, or to have some best practices around them, like summarize the notes in your own words. Don't just simply notate exactly what the educator is saying, and it's better to have them in handwriting as well.
I sometimes export my electronic book notes into a program called I Do Recall, and then I make myself flashcards out of them.
What are some good flashcard apps that you use, or some good note-taking apps that you use to help our listeners?
My favorite is I Do Recall, which is rebranding as smarterhumans.ai. The reason I like this is because if you go, let's say you can't remember something, with I Do Recall, you can actually go back to the original link and see the context of whatever you are trying to remember. And this context can really help reinforce what you're trying to learn and remember. It also has an AI button, so you can like load an electronic document on, and it will create flashcards of the key ideas in this, whatever research paper you're trying to better understand. Of course, there's other systems. So, for example, Kahoot, kind of the grandmaster of them all is Anki. And Anki can do a lot, but I find it a little bit difficult because if I don't use it all the time, then it can do so much that you can forget like all the different ways to use it, and it's not quite so intuitive, at least for me. But there's a number of flashcard systems out there. I really like I Do Recall because of this AI feature as well as linking to the context. But if you go in and use ChatGPT to help you as well, that can also be, there's so many ways now to use generative AI to help you with your learning as well.
Before we get to the final segment, I love your insights about speed reading programs, because I see this a lot with leaders that they're recommended, but what you state, which I think is really relevant here, is speed reading programs often recommend focusing on 3 words at a time to help reduce the number of jumps or eye motions, but it doesn't speed up your brain's processing, period. And so and that's what slows you down. It's not the jump. What's holding everyone up in their reading speed, which not many people can read faster than, say, 400 words a minute, is your mental processing, the recognition of a word, your self-vocalization, and how you convert that idea to a concept, how fast that is.
I mean, you can only understand things so quickly. And this is one reason why I love to watch videos when I'm learning something, because I can pause a video if I don't understand something and I can think about what a person is saying. And people are always like, oh, in class is so much better. But I can't pause a person who's talking to me in class, and sometimes I just need to think about what someone is saying, and that is really helpful for me, and I think many people are like that.
In your experience, what separates great learners from average ones, regardless of IQ or formal education?
That's a little bit of a leading question because sometimes you can be a great learner, but you don't really do much with what you've learned. And you can be a really average learner. Like some of my engineering students they were awful students, but they would think really creatively. And whatever they did actually learn, well, they'd come back and tell me like 10 years later, I won the Boss Kettering Award. And for best and most innovative engineering product. So I don't like to think of people as being best learners or average learners because it's what you get from what you've learned that's more important than whether whether you're a good learner or a bad learner, so to speak.
Well, the final question before we wrap up is, if you had to recommend one key strategy from all your books, what would that be?
Be aware that if you learn how to learn, there are so many tricks that can improve your life, improve the life of the people you are working with, improve the lives of your own kids. These learning about how to learn is really the ultimate in learning and will be incredibly helpful through your life.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for joining me today. Let our listeners know how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Oh, I'm at barbaraoakley.com. There's a lot there on my website, and there's even more if you go, for example, to Coursera. You can see a lot of my different courses with my wonderful colleagues and my books with my co-authors on Amazon.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.